For more than 2 years, from the outbreak of war in May 1, 803, Napoleon was intermittently obsessed by the invasion of England. His mood oscillated between euphoria and facile optimism on the one hand, and gloomy despair and defeatism on the other. His frequent journeyings in these years are a good barometer of a restless soul, a man impatient with the many logistical frustrations of the steady build-up of men and material in the Channel ports. His day-to-day itinerary betrays the zigzag pattern of a man temperamentally incapable of, as well as prevented by circumstances from, concentrating on any single objective. A tour of ports in the Pas de Calais in June 1803 was swiftly followed by a trip to Belgium. He was back in Boulogne again for a fortnight in November 1, 803, and again for a further 2 weeks in January 1, 804. The engine affair and the imperial coronation occupied most of that year, but in July he was in the Channel ports for a month. Then came 2 weeks in Aix-la-Chapelle at the beginning of September, followed by a tour of the Rhineland during the last 2 weeks of the month. The coronation and its aftermath necessitated a lengthy stay in Paris, but in April 1, 805 the emperor was off again, this time on a 14-week trip to Italy for his coronation in Milan, scarcely pausing at St. Cloud. He was at Boulogne again for the climax of the invasion attempt in August 1, 805, since all gunboats and sloops prepared for the would-be descents on England in 1798. And 1801 were by now in an advanced state of disrepair or had simply rotted away. Napoleon had to start from scratch. Undeterred by the fact that he had just 13 ships of the line against England's 52, he took heart from the bold showing of his men during Nelson's raids on Boulogne in August and September 1, 801, when French Marines repulsed a British commando assault on the port with heavy loss. He now conceived an elaborate plan whereby 2 fleets would be constructed secretly and simultaneously at Dunkirk and Cherbourg, ready for a final rendezvous at Boulogne, which the emperor decided was the most feasible launching pad for an enterprise against England. Troops would be assembled at Boulogne at the last moment, and there would be smaller bases at Wimreux and Ambleteuse. The 4 principal army corps, each with artillery park, would be held back at Utrecht, Bruges, Saint-Omer and Montreal until the very last minute, to keep the enemy guessing, but a 5th corps would prepare only at Brest as if an invasion of Ireland was the real project. Whereas the Cherbourg flotilla was to consist of 20 sloops and 80 gunboats, the much larger one at Dunkirk would comprise 100 sloops and 320 gunboats. A variety of boats was used, but principally the praams, sailing barges 100 feet from bow to stern, 23 feet in the beam, rigged like a corvette and armed with 12 24-pounders. A smaller version of the praam, armed with 3 24-pounders and an 8 inches howitzer, and rigged like a brig, was the chaloupe canonniere. For transporting horses, ammunition and artillery there were the 3-masted Badox cannonieres, resembling a fishing smack, with stables in the hold, a 24-pounder in the bow and a howitzer at the stern. Then there were the peniches, undecked vessels, 60 feet long by 10 wide, basically converted trading craft and fishing smacks. Finally, there were 60-foot sloops propelled by lug sails and oars and used exclusively for troop transport. In his early period of invasion euphoria, Napoleon displayed an amazing concern for detail. Nothing seemed too small to be beneath his notice, and at Saint-Omer Marshal Soult was astonished to receive a virtual manual of drill for soldiers operating the peniches which contained detail that would have occurred only to a cox of oarsmen. He squeezed Dutch, Spanish and Portuguese allies for money to finance the invasion, but even so could not drum up enough to cover the huge expenses and was in the end forced to raise a loan at the prohibitive interest rate of 5%. Some idea of the cost can be seen from a shipowner's tariff at the time. A praam cost 70,000 francs, a chaloupe canonniere 35,000 francs, a Bateau canonniere I8 23,000 francs and a peniche I2 5,000 francs. Still hugely confident, he dubbed his forces the Army of England and wrote to Cambaceres that he had viewed the English coast across the sea from Ambleteuse on a clear day, and the Channel was merely a ditch will be leapt as soon as someone has the guts to try. A week later he wrote to Admiral Ganteaume in Toulon, 8 hours of night in favorable weather would decide the fate of the universe. By October I-803 Minister of Marine Decrès reported the flotilla in possession of 367 vessels of all types. All major embarkation ports had been improved by deepening, and the problem of getting an invasion off from Boulogne on a single tide, which had so bedeviled French invasion attempts in I-745, 1759 and I-798, was to be solved by building a breakwater and sluice. Yet even at this stage Napoleon had not come to terms with the fundamental problem that would in the end bring all his grandiose plans to grief. In a word, he had not absorbed the lesson, a commonplace to professional sailors, that navies could not simply be switched from theater to theater, as could land troops in war gaming or actual operations. The emperor had no real conception of the effects of winds and waves and, while he vaguely understood that the peniches could not stand up to a heavy Atlantic swell, he failed to realize that the praams also lacked the ability to withstand a heavy sea. The 8 hours glibly referred to in the letter to Ganteaume presupposed an unlikely combination, especially in dark winter months, the absence of the Royal Navy and a channel as calm as a millpond. Another initial error, which he did later make good, was the assumption that a Z-0 strong invasion flotilla, containing IS-0 troops and S-0 sailors and auxiliaries, could cross the channel to a beachhead without the support of a covering fleet. When asked about this, Napoleon airily spoke about crossing in fog, apparently unaware of the chaos and near certain disaster that would ensue if an uncoordinated armada tried to run the gauntlet in mutual invisibility. He tried to overwhelm well-grounded objections with an appeal to revolutionary zeal and French patriotism. S-0 laborers were set to constructing berthing places in the Channel ports, in the process virtually constructing a new port at Ambleteuse, but the commander of the invasion flotilla, Admiral Bruix, nervously pointed out to the emperor that such commendable zeal did not actually solve the outstanding problems. The British, aware that Napoleon was in deadly earnest, raised militias, constructed beacons and Martello towers, and tried to dispose their fleet to cover any contingency. Nelson invested Toulon while Admiral Cornwallis blockaded Brest. The emperor meanwhile showed himself once more a master of propaganda by arranging for the Bayeux Tapestry, a reminder of an earlier, successful invasion of England, to be taken on tour. Yet the British were no slouches at propaganda and disinformation themselves, and spread panic through the French army at Boulogne in R804 with a cleverly planted rumor that bales of cotton carrying a plague virus had been cast onto the beaches around Boulogne. The war of nerves seemed to be tilting Britain's way in the autumn of R803 when news came in that Robert Emmet's pro-French coup in Dublin had failed dismally, making it now seem implausible that the corps assembling at Brest could be sent to Ireland. By the end of the year, Napoleon had been brought down to earth from his dream castles. All his staff work pointed to depressing conclusions. The flotilla was not weatherly enough for a winter crossing of the Channel. The movement of shipping from the assembly ports to the concentration area had been badly affected by the weather and Royal Navy interceptions. A calculation of winds and tides threw up too many imponderables, including the nightmare scenario that the flotilla might be becalmed in mid-sea for 3 days or that it would take 6 days to get the entire armada out of Boulogne. In January 1, 804, Napoleon bowed to the inevitable and ordered the project shelved. This was an acute personal disappointment, for he had even chosen the boat in which he intended to cross the Channel. But he stressed that his order meant postponement only, not cancellation. In March 1, 804, he wrote to his ambassador in Constantinople, "In the present position of Europe, all my thoughts are directed towards England. Nearly 120,000 men and 3,000 boats. Only await a favorable wind to plant the Imperial Eagle on the Tower of London." A believer in bad omens, he made light of an incident in January when his horse tripped over a cable and threw him into the sea, laughing it off, but doubtless inwardly troubled. He said, "It's nothing. It's only a bath." When he returned seriously to the invasion project in July 1, 804, he began by conceding that his earlier ideas were chimerical. He would have to use the French fleet somehow to hold the Royal Navy at bay, and he would have to make the attempt in fine weather in the summer. But an alarming incident on the 20th of July showed that he had still not completely absorbed the problems posed by the elements. That day a gale was blowing which threatened to develop into a full storm. Napoleon blithely insisted that a scheduled naval review go ahead, which drew vociferous protests from Admiral Bruix. When Bruix persisted, he was dismissed on the spot and later exiled. His successor, Admiral Magan, dared not risk the imperial wrath further and gave the order to put to sea. In the ensuing storm, ships were wrecked and over 2,000 soldiers and sailors drowned. The emperor strode up and down the beach in a fury but expressed no remorse for the lives he had lost by his folly. The year 1804 saw Napoleon engaged in 2 major stratagems to outfox the Royal Navy, as he strove to make good his oft-repeated dictum, "Let us be masters of the Straits of Dover for 6 hours and we shall be masters of the world." His first scheme depended on luring away the English under Admiral Cornwallis, who was then blockading Brest. Admiral Ganteaume would clear for Ireland with his squadron, tying down Cornwallis outside Brest. Meanwhile, Latouche-Treville, the admiral of the fleet and by far Napoleon's best naval commander, would come up from Toulon with 11 ships of the line, link off Cadiz with the Rochefort squadron and then fetch a wide compass into the Atlantic before looping round into the western approaches north of Cornwallis. Latouche-Treville would then proceed to the Straits of Dover to cover the crossing of the flotilla from Boulogne. This was an ingenious plan on paper, but it did not explain how the Toulon fleet was to emerge safely and avoid Nelson's blockading squadron. Latouche-Treville duly tried to come out but was driven back by Nelson. When the able French admiral died 2 months later, the project died with him. Napoleon, who had no great opinion of Villeneuve, considered the implementation of such an intricate plan beyond the man he reluctantly promoted to admiral of the fleet. In September 1, 804 he tried again. This time his conception was even more elaborate and we can detect elements of a fantastic Promethean self-delusion in his strategic imagination, which now bade fair to embrace the globe. The main thrust of the project was a revived invasion of Ireland, but this time to be attempted with forces greater than any yet landed on John Bull's other island. Marshal Augereau was designated commander of the 16,000 troops which Ganteaume was ordered to take to Lough Swilly or environs. The emperor even gave details on the track to be adopted: a wide sweep into the Atlantic, an approach to the north of Ireland from the west, and a successful landfall. Once Augereau's troops were ashore, Ganteaume was to take his course back to Cherbourg to ascertain the situation in the Channel. If all was ready at Boulogne, and the winds favored the crossing of the Grand Army, he was to fall on the British blockading squadron. If this were not possible, Ganteaume was to switch to Plan B, pass through the Straits of Dover to Texel to join 7 Dutch ships of the line, and then transports and another 25,000 men would be taken to Lough Swilly as the second wave of a gigantic French incursion into Ireland. The emperor was pleased with the apparent mathematical cogency of his new plan. As he saw it, one of these scenarios had to work out, which meant that he would either have armies in both England and Ireland or would have over 40,000 men on Irish soil, an irresistible force for the permanent wresting of the island from the British grip. But there was an element of over-egging the pudding in the capstone Napoleon put to his grand strategy, which surely shows once again the romantic vanquishing the classicist, and the poet Manque the mathematician. As if the orders to Ganteaume were not complex enough, he also ordered the Toulon fleet, now under Villeneuve, and the Rochefort squadron he used to command to sail in separate divisions for the West Indies. The Toulon fleet was to recapture Suriname and the Dutch colonies and take reinforcements to Santo Domingo. Additionally, it was to detach a small contingent of ships and 500 men to capture St. Helena and cut the East Indies trade route. The Rochefort squadron meanwhile was to capture Dominica and St. Lucia, reinforce the French position at Martinique and Guadeloupe, and then attack Jamaica and the British West Indies. As a final piece of icing on the strategic cake, Villeneuve and Mississy were to rendezvous in the West Indies and return together to Europe, there to raise the Royal Navy blockade on the ports of Ferrol and Corunna. With these grandiose and rather absurd plans we see clearly Napoleon's Achilles heel, the inability to concentrate on a single clear objective to the exclusion of all others. The thinking was that Mississy and Villeneuve would decoy Cornwallis away to the West Indies, for the British would surely have to divert in strength to deal with the threat to their position in the Caribbean, thus allowing Ganteaume the freedom for his multifaceted mission. The orders concerning Ferrol and Corunna were meant to give a last nudge to Spain to declare war on Britain, with whom she had been teetering on the edge of hostilities for months. But it was all much too convoluted in conception and was vulnerable to the obvious objection that as each part of the plan connected with every other, the possibility of something going badly wrong increased exponentially. The amazing thing was that Napoleon nearly pulled it off, only to be thwarted by the elements. Everything was against the grand design. No one had thought how to divert Nelson from the blockade of Toulon. Security was blown almost instantly, and the ease with which British secret agents got wind of the stratagem has led some scholars to conclude that Napoleon had already abandoned serious hopes of an invasion of England, and was feeding disinformation to the enemy. Yet, against all the odds, on the 11th of January 1805 Mississy, and the Rochefort fleet evaded its wind-bound blockaders and, even more incredibly, Villeneuve too escaped from Toulon while Nelson's ships were watering in Sardinia. Despite crowding on sail, Nelson was unable to catch up with or even locate Villeneuve, and for the first time England's greatest sailor began to feel genuine alarm. Yet Villeneuve, having momentarily outwitted the British, was laid low by the weather. After a terrible battering in the Gulf of Lyons, he lost his nerve and crept back into the safety of Toulon. When Napoleon heard of his admiral's humiliating failure, his rage was a sight to behold. The volcanic anger is still evident in his correspondence in February. What is to be done with admirals who allow their spirits to sink and determine to hasten home at the first damage they may receive? A few topmasts carried away, some casualties in a gale of wind are everyday occurrences. 2 days of fine weather ought to have cheered up the crews and put everything to rights. But the greatest evil of our navy is that the men who command it are unused to all the risks of command. The emperor's withering scorn was warranted. Villeneuve's self-serving justification for his actions is decisively refuted by the fact that Nelson rode out the self-same storms without sustaining significant damage to his ships. It should be stressed that the British by no means simply awaited Napoleon's next move, they made serious assaults of their own, and there was always the danger that one of these might make grave inroads on the invasion flotilla and so lead to the cancellation of the whole enterprise. In September R803 the Royal Navy bombarded deep in Calais from the sea, though without momentous result. Then, in March-April R804 it attempted to block Boulogne harbor by scuttling a group of stone-laden ships at the entrance to the harbor. However, the attempt was bedeviled by incompetent planning and adverse weather and was finally abandoned in a welter of mutual recriminations. In October and November Boulogne was bombarded with rockets, and mines and torpedoes were used, though again without effect. But the British never gave up, and another such vain attack was made as late as November R805 when all danger of an invasion had receded. There were those in England who urged amphibious assaults by commandos and marines, but the experience of the 7 Years' War, and even more so 1798 when our 400 men were lost in a futile attempt to destroy Ostend Canal, argued against such tactics. The defences at Boulogne and the other Channel ports were extremely strong, and the risks in landing and re-embarking troops, especially in bad weather, were deemed unacceptable. In R8OS, Napoleon made his final, and in many ways most determined, attempt to gain that crucial temporary superiority at sea that would allow the Grand Army to cross the Channel. But once again his strategy was the work of a Cartesian a priorist, a mathematician used to commanding land armies and with no real understanding of the minutiae of naval warfare. The one dubious card he held that was not available to him in R804 was the Spanish Navy, for Spain had finally entered the war in December R804. But the Emperor's attempts to confront the Royal Navy with an equally large Franco-Spanish fleet simply meant that problems of logistics and coordination were compounded. The elements of the putative Grand Armada were now dispersed in 6 different ports, the French in Toulon, Rochefort, Brest and Ferrol, the Spanish in Cadiz and Cartagena. On the 2nd of March R8OS, Napoleon composed a memorandum setting out his grand naval strategy for that year. Villeneuve was ordered to find ways of breaking out of Toulon again, and this time staying out until he had completed his mission. He was to pick up the Spanish in Cadiz and Cartagena, and sail to Martinique for rendezvous with Mississy and the Rochefort squadron. Since Villeneuve commanded 11 battleships, 6 frigates and 2 corvettes, and the Spanish Admiral Gravina had 7 battleships and a frigate, at the rendezvous there should already be a powerful French fleet. Yet Napoleon's idea was that the greatest Franco-Spanish naval force ever seen should assemble at Martinique, for he also ordered Admiral Ganteaume to break out from Brest with his 21 ships of the line, defeat the blockading squadron at Faro and take the French and Spanish ships there to Martinique. A huge armada of more than 40 front-line warships would then proceed to Europe, keeping away from land and shipping lanes. Since the British could not possibly know where the various French squadrons were, and still less, that they had all united at Martinique, there would be only a token force on guard at Ushant and the western approaches. Brushing this aside, the Franco-Spanish fleet was then to make all speed to Boulogne to cover the invasion flotilla. Napoleon envisaged the final act of the drama taking place sometime between June and July. It is one of the great examples of wishful thinking in the history of warfare. It assumed there would be no problems from storm or high seas, that the Royal Navy would behave exactly as he predicted, and that Nelson would be toiling far in the rear when the Franco-Spanish fleet entered the Channel. It also assumed, despite the evidence of the previous year, that Villeneuve and Ganteaume would have no problem breaking the blockades at their respective ports. Most of all, it betrayed an ignorance of the elementary facts of navigation. Naturally, if an enemy army was investing French troops in a city, the blockade could be broken by sending a relieving force. Napoleon assumed the same held good at sea, but a moment's consideration should have shown him that his strategy was chimerical. If the wind was favorable for a rescue fleet sailing from the west to relieve a blockade, it could not at the same time be favorable for the blockaded fleet trying to escape to the west. The writing was on the wall as Ganteaume failed to get out of Brest despite strenuous efforts on 26–28 of March 1805, when the French admiral was stymied by the Emperor's orders that he should avoid giving battle to Calder's blockading fleet. The tight British blockade throttled a further escape bid in April. Villeneuve, however, against all the odds, did manage to get away, successfully picked up the Spanish at Cadiz and stood away from Martinique on the 9th of April. Sir John Ord, stationed off Cadiz, failed to take appropriate action. Nelson was left without any clear intelligence of the enemy. His guess this time was wrong, as it had been when Villeneuve first broke out in 1804, for he thought the Toulon fleet was merely aiming to relieve Ganteaume at Brest prior to an invasion of Ireland. Mississy meanwhile raided throughout the West Indies, as ordered in the 1804 strategy. Too late, Napoleon suddenly realized that he had not put Mississy in the picture on his new thinking, and sent him an express, with orders to await Villeneuve at Martinique and not to leave the Caribbean before the end of June. The ship bearing this message crossed with Mississy, who, finding no Villeneuve at Martinique, tried to second-guess Napoleon's intentions and decided to return to Europe. The fact was that he was in clear breach of orders, since he sailed for Europe before the last date set down in contingency instructions for the rendezvous with Villeneuve. For this he was justifiably dismissed by Napoleon, but the Emperor must share some of the blame for the confusion. The comedy of errors continued. On the 20th of May, Mississy arrived at Rochefort to find that Villeneuve was trying to rendezvous with him in the West Indies. 6 days earlier, Villeneuve arrived at Martinique, well ahead of Nelson, who was still in Madeira, to learn that the Rochefort squadron had returned to Europe. Villeneuve's orders were to await Ganteaume in Martinique for 5 weeks, but on the 4th of June he learned that Nelson had arrived in Barbados in hot pursuit, so immediately cleared for Europe. Nelson himself, having gradually worked out the tortuous reasoning in the emperor's mind, put about for Europe on the 13th of June. By now it was abundantly clear what the French strategy was. Napoleon meanwhile was in Italy, absurdly boasting to his followers that Nelson was still in Europe, with badly damaged ships and exhausted crews. Such was his aplomb that he committed the cardinal error of trying to control a global strategy meant to dovetail with an invasion of England, from Milan and Genoa. This was an endeavor beyond his powers even if he had been in Paris, but in Italy, where intelligence was hopelessly out of date by the time it reached him, it was pure cloud cuckoo land. It was almost as though the emperor had reacted self-destructively to the manifold problems of an invasion of England by turning it into a part-time occupation. In any case, he severely underrated the enemy. It was true that for 4 months the British did not know where Villeneuve was, but they guessed what lay behind some pretty transparent naval posturing and simply strengthened their watch on the western approaches at Ushant. Napoleon could never realize that, no matter what elaborate feints and deceptions he attempted, the Royal Navy would never relax its grip on the mouth of the Channel. But Napoleon for a time lived in a fool's paradise. Believing that Nelson had been successfully decoyed, he began to convince himself that England's downfall was now a matter of weeks rather than months. On the 9th of June he wrote in high euphoria, "If England is aware of the serious game she is playing, she will raise the blockade of Brest. But I know not in truth what kind of precaution will protect her from the terrible chance she runs. A nation is very foolish, when it has no fortifications and no army, to lay itself open to seeing an army of our veteran troops land on its shores. This is the masterpiece of the flotilla. It costs a great deal of money, but it is necessary for us to be masters of the sea for 6 hours only, and England will have ceased to exist." Then came news of the true situation. Angry and frustrated at the unraveling of his plans, the emperor tried to salvage something from the wreckage. Hearing that Villeneuve was returning to Europe, he sent a courier to order him to lift the Brest blockade and then proceed to the Channel, again the assumption that naval blockades were just like land sieges. He compounded this fatuity by ordering the still blockaded Ganteaume to meet him at Boulogne by the beginning of August. He omitted to tell his admiral how he was to achieve this. On the 19th of July, Villeneuve found himself toiling off Cape Finisterre, running in the teeth of a violent gale. The tempest gave way next day to a thick blanket of fog, which hid enemy movements. Had he been able to see, Villeneuve would have observed the Atlantic fleet of Sir Robert Calder maneuvering to tackle any French squadron trying to break Cornwallis's blockade of Brest. On the 22nd of July the two fleets came in sight of each other. Villeneuve and Gravina engaged Calder and a 4.5-hour pounding battle was the result. It was an indecisive clash, which both sides claimed as a victory, and the strategic results were also inconclusive. On the one hand, Villeneuve and Gravina were able to link with the Faroe fleet, bringing their total strength up to 29 ships of the line. On the other, Calder linked up with Cornwallis to tighten the noose around Brest. This was the moment when a French admiral of genius might have acted decisively. If Villeneuve had headed back to Ushant immediately, he would have caught the Royal Navy between two fires, forced either to abandon the blockade of Brest or let the French into the Channel. The danger was particularly acute since an error by Cornwallis at one stage left just 17 ships to dispute the entrance to the Channel. But he dithered in Ferrol, pointlessly having his ships repainted while complaining to all who would listen that French naval tactics were obsolete. Nelson meanwhile arrived at Gibraltar on July and at once headed north to join his strength to that of Calder and Cornwallis. 36 battleships now barred the entry to the Channel. The end result of all Napoleon's convoluted and serpentine global feints and stratagems was that the Royal Navy was present in strength at exactly the right point to destroy his invasion plans. On the 13th of August, Villeneuve learned of this new concentration of enemy forces, and in despair sailed south for Cadiz, where he allowed his combined fleet to be bottled up by Admiral Collingwood with just 3 ships, a stunning demonstration of the moral and psychological advantage the Royal Navy enjoyed over its French counterpart. Unaware of any of these developments, Napoleon arrived at Boulogne on the 3rd of August, imagining that the invasion launch was little more than 24 hours away. But when he reached his headquarters at Pont de Brigues, he was alarmed to discover that all was not well even with the Boulogne flotilla. There was no problem about transports. 1,200 boats lay ready at Boulogne and another 1,100 at nearby ports. The naval commissars in fact had done their work so well that there were more boats than soldiers to fill them. Only 90,000 of the expected RS-00 were ready to move at a moment's notice, and only 3,000 of the expected 9,000 cavalry horses. And, despite the fact that they had had 2 years to solve the problem, Napoleon's marine engineers had not yet devised a way of getting the flotilla out to sea on a single tide. It would still take 3 tides to get the armada out onto the open channel, thus lengthening the time it would lie vulnerable to devastating attacks from the Royal Navy. Morale was low among men who had been cooped up in barracks and cantonments for 2 years, waiting for the signal that never came. There were many altercations between bored and rampaging soldiers and local civilians, including a notorious pitched battle in Rados between female camp followers and local women, which reads like the Village Affray and Tom Jones and produced more than 50 casualties. However, none of this affected Napoleon's superb confidence. Constant records that Napoleon diverted himself with the charms of a beautiful Genoese courtesan. As late as the morning of the 23rd of August he was still able to write that in his imagination he saw the tricolour fluttering over the Tower of London. Then a messenger arrived with news that Villeneuve had retreated to Cadiz, where he was now bottled up. By all accounts, this time Napoleon completely lost control of himself and was frothing at the mouth like a madman. After an outburst of violent and unprecedented rage, which his followers thought would probably end in an apoplectic fit, Napoleon that night allowed himself a few snatches of sick frustration as he wrote, "What a navy! What sacrifices all for nothing! All hope is gone." Villeneuve, instead of entering the Channel, has taken refuge in Cadiz. It is all over. After the 23rd of August 1805, the invasion of England was never again a live option for Napoleon. Blaming Villeneuve for the débâcle, on the 18th of September he sent Admiral Rosalie to Cadiz as the new admiral of the fleet together with a letter of dismissal for Villeneuve. This turned out to be another of Napoleon's psychological errors. To forestall the shame of replacement, Villeneuve took the Franco-Spanish Armada out of Cadiz and into the jaws of the powerful fleet Nelson had assembled on the Atlantic side of Gibraltar. The Battle of Trafalgar, fought on the 21st of October, resulted in catastrophic defeat for Villeneuve. It was one of the most glorious episodes in the history of the Royal Navy. Supremely important in the history and legend of England and Horatio Nelson, Trafalgar is a mere footnote in the story of Napoleon, who had already called off his invasion plans 2 months before the battle. Yet Trafalgar always haunted Napoleon. After 1805 he rarely risked his warships. 4 more ships of the line were captured 2 weeks after Trafalgar, 5 were taken off Santo Domingo in February 1806, 5 destroyed by fireships in the Basque Roads in April 1, 809, and 2 destroyed in the Mediterranean in October the same year. But that completes the tally in the Emperor's ill-fated attempt to wage naval warfare against England. These were rare opportunities for the Royal Navy, since Napoleon after Trafalgar kept his squadrons in port as a permanent threat, one the British did not take lightly as he continually added to the number of his capital ships. A war of nerves developed, with the Emperor constantly fomenting rumors of invasion, particularly of Ireland or the colonies. He encouraged his privateers to prey on British shipping and tried to secure the fleets of neutral European powers. His clever policy of keeping warships in full readiness in French ports meant that the Royal Navy could never relax, and, more importantly, that Britain had to maintain its navy on permanent red alert, with the astronomical costs this entailed. The British were also wrong-footed diplomatically, by being forced into illegal interventions against neutral shipping, as at Copenhagen in R807. Napoleon's ill-starred attempt to invade England in R80305 was essentially vitiated by his lack of understanding of the sea and the problems faced by mariners. He expected his admirals to move like generals, without regard to wind and wave, and was notably unforgiving when they failed to come up to the mark. To an extent he was unlucky, since the French Nelson, La Touche-Treville, died unexpectedly and he was left with second-rate men. Bruix and Mississy felt his wrath, but none more so than Villeneuve. Taken prisoner after Trafalgar, when his flagship Bucentaure was forced to strike colors, Villeneuve remained in captivity in England until April R806. Returning to France and learning that he was still in deep disgrace with the Emperor, Villeneuve, aged just 43, stabbed himself to death at Rennes. Ironically, it was to Villeneuve that Napoleon owed potentially his best chance of a successful descent on England. For 6 days in March R8os, while Villeneuve was luring Nelson away to the Caribbean, the channel opposite Boulogne was virtually unguarded, but by this time Napoleon had convinced himself that a crossing could never be made except under cover of a fleet. In any case, he was not at Boulogne in March, and here we see clearly the gravest defect of the imperial invasion plans. Too often Napoleon's mind was on other things, when an invasion project required monomaniacal 24-hour concentration. The enemy he should always have focused on was England. but he wasted his intellectual substance on a dozen other projects, making himself king of Italy, destroying the Holy Roman Emperor, founding the Confederation of the Rhine, reviving Poland, adding Illyria to his empire, colliding with Russia in the east. He should have grasped that England was the paramount problem and devoted all his resources to defeating her. Why, for instance, did he spend on his navy not even a tenth of the sum he lavished on continental warfare? Napoleon seems always to have underrated the problem of England, to have regarded her as a noise offstage, to have viewed her as an obstacle to his plans rather than as the one enemy above all others who had to be defeated. Yet concentrating on England required a different, more Fabian, cast of personality. Even his hero Hannibal was prepared to settle in for a 15-year war of attrition against Rome. But Napoleon was temperamentally too impatient. He always wanted spectacular results and he wanted them now. This inability to concentrate and the hopeless failure of Napoleon's invasion plans in R80305 has tempted some historians, unwisely, to suggest that the projected descent on England was always a feint, designed to mask continental ambitions. According to this view, the huge army assembled at Boulogne was actually used against Austria and Russia, so this must have been the emperor's intention all along. Besides, he never abandoned his Italian ambitions and actively pursued them when he was supposed to be concentrating on the problem of England. And if he truly wanted to invade England, would he really have provoked Austria and Russia to the point where they were likely, had he crossed the Channel, to launch themselves on France's undefended flank? Moreover, Desprières, the great student of Napoleon's invasion plans, detected a number of strange discrepancies and oversights in both the detailed planning at Boulogne and the overall strategy, leading him to doubt the seriousness of Napoleon's intentions. The feint view was always encouraged by Napoleon when emperor, as part of the propaganda image of his invincibility and infallibility. Since he had failed lamentably at Boulogne in R80305, it was in his interest to pretend that he had never seriously intended to invade England. But on St. Helena he finally admitted the truth. He was in deadly earnest but had bungled things. All relevant circumstantial evidence bears this out. Even if he had been willing to spend millions of francs on Sioux invasion craft he knew would never be used, how do we explain the agonizing about the need for covering fleet action? A feint to deceive European powers would have worked perfectly well without ordering Villeneuve, Ganteaume and the other admirals to the West Indies to draw off defending squadrons. If Napoleon was merely feinting, he must have been the greatest actor of all time, and his terrifying rage when he learned of Villeneuve's retreat to Cadiz the cheap trick of a thespian and charlatan. Besides, if he was feinting, Napoleon was certainly playing with fire. It was certainly possible that Ganteaume and Villeneuve could have combined and entered the Channel while Nelson was still far away in the Atlantic. If that had happened, the alleged bluff at Boulogne would have been called in truly spectacular fashion. However, it is certainly true that the assembly of a huge army at Boulogne turned out to be an act of serendipity from the viewpoint of the general political and military crisis, one that Napoleon confronted in R8OS as the result of his centrifugal foreign policy, where no one clear aim was ever pursued to the exclusion of others. Even as he assembled the Grand Army at Boulogne, his thoughts often turned to the occupation of the Italian ports of Taranto, Otranto and Brindisi as springboards for an assault on Turkey. Was this the Promethean mind of a genius or simply a rational objective? The invasion of England, being overwhelmed by the Oriental complex. By R805 the European powers had lost patience with Napoleon and English gold gave them the necessary push to go to war. Even so, the genesis of the Third Coalition was complex, with Austria and Russia actuated by very different considerations. Austria was furious with Napoleon for his annexation of Genoa, Piedmont and Elba, his conversion of the Cisalpine Republic into a kingdom, his occupation of Naples and his provocative aping of Charlemagne in May R8OS, when he crowned himself Emperor of Italy in Milan Cathedral, using the Lombardy crown. All of this was not only contrary to the Treaty of Luneville but exposed the hollowness of Napoleon's assurances, given on each FNSH annexation, that this was positively his last territorial ambition. Further offense was given by Napoleon's so-called mediation in Switzerland, and this turned to outrage when the French emperor proceeded to reconstruct Germany. He reduced the Holy Roman Empire from 350 princelings to just 39 and made himself the guarantor of this trivial remainder. Talleyrand once more warned Napoleon that Austria would not stand idly by and see her spheres of influence in both Germany and Italy so blatantly truncated. He argued that peace with Austria was the lodestone by which the emperor should steer his foreign policy, otherwise France would be involved in a never-ending cycle of European warfare. He proposed getting Austria to acquiesce in the loss of Italy by offering her Moldavia and Wallachia at the mouth of the Danube. This would have a twofold effect. It would detach Austria from Russia and link Vienna with France in the drive towards Turkey in the east. But Napoleon wanted none of it. Russian feelings towards France were even more complexly layered by R8OS.